The metallic sound of the old key turning in the lock echoed through the empty hallway of the Mitchells' house. Rebecca, with her brown hair in a messy bun, hesitated for a moment before pushing open the heavy oak door. The interior of the century-old residence on Maple Street still held Grandpa Theodore's characteristic scent, a mixture of pipe tobacco and old books. "Are you sure you don't want me to come in with you, dear?" asked Martin, her husband, standing in the doorway. Rebecca shook her head negatively. She needed this moment alone. "I'll start sorting out the office papers. Can you check the garage?" "With Kevin," she replied, referring to her younger brother who was waiting outside distractedly fiddling with his cell phone. The three-story Victorian house had been Theodore Mitchell's home for more than 5 decades. Now, 3 months after his death at the age of 86, his grandchildren had the painful task of preparing the property for sale. The bills for the cancer treatment had eaten up a large part of the family's savings, leaving them with no other choice. Rebecca climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor where her grandfather's office was located. The room was exactly as she remembered it, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookcases filled with meticulously organized books, the old massive desk next to the bay window, and the worn leather armchair where Theodore spent hours immersed in his accounting books. As she opened the desk drawers, Rebecca found dozens of notebooks, all filled with her grandfather's impeccable handwriting. As a respected accountant in Burlington, Theodore had always been known for his meticulousness and discretion. Leafing through one of the older notebooks dating from 1975, something caught his eye, a series of numbers underlined in red and cryptic notes in the margins. "Becca, come and see this," Kevin's voice echoed from the back garden. Reluctant to abandon her discovery, Rebecca went down to the back garden where she found her brother crouched next to a bed of wilted roses. "What's wrong?" she asked, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "Remember when Grandpa wouldn't let anyone touch this bed? Look what he had buried here." Kevin showed her an old cookie tin corroded by time. Inside was a bundle of yellowed letters and a black notebook. The brothers took their discovery to the back porch. The letters, all addressed to Theodore, were signed by one Richard Hammond, the city's former public works secretary who died more than a decade ago. As they read, their faces paled. "My God," whispered Rebecca, "Grandpa has uncovered an embezzlement scheme. The money that was supposed to go towards building the Burlington Children's Hospital in 1976. It was diverted to offshore accounts," Kevin added, leafing through the booklet containing bank numbers and codes. "But why didn't he ever report it?" The answer came in the form of a letter dated 1977 in which Theodore explained his reasons in a never-before-sent rant, veiled threats against his family, especially Eleanor, his only child and mother of Rebecca and Kevin. In the days that followed, the Mitchell brothers plunged into a private investigation. The documents found revealed an elaborate corruption scheme that had prevented the construction of the Children's Hospital, a project that could have saved countless lives. Theodore had meticulously documented every suspicious transaction, every secret meeting, every threat received. The discovery attracted the attention of Charlotte Anderson, a young reporter for the Burlington Free Press, who began working with the brothers to uncover the whole story. The case gained even more relevance when they discovered that some of those involved still held important public positions in the city. "Your grandfather was an extraordinary man," commented Charlotte, examining the documents spread out on the kitchen table. "He spent years collecting evidence, even though he knew he couldn't use any of it right now." Rebecca picked up one of the last letters, found dated just 3 months before Theodore's death. "Keeping this secret has eaten me up inside all these years. But now, when they can no longer threaten me or those I love, I leave this evidence as my last act of redemption. May the truth finally come out." The weight of those words hit Rebecca like a punch in the gut. Her grandfather, always so quiet and reserved, had carried that burden alone for decades, protecting his family, while silently documenting every aspect of the corruption he witnessed. The house, which had initially been sold quickly to cover debts, now became the epicenter of an investigation that promised to shake up Burlington's political structures. Every day, more documents were found hidden in the most unlikely places inside. Hollowed-out books under loose floorboards, even inside the walls. "I think I understand why he never wanted to move out of this house," said Kevin, watching the sunset through the living room window. It wasn't just emotional attachment. Disappeared from the town hall in 1977, the last piece of the puzzle that Theodore had been unable to find. "Someone else was keeping secrets," said Charlotte, photographing each page. "Someone who waited all this time for the truth to come out." The impact of these discoveries reverberated beyond Burlington. National newspapers began covering the story. Federal investigators showed interest in the case mainly because of the connections to current corruption schemes. Rebecca spent an entire evening in her grandfather's office rereading his notes with a fresh eye. "He knew this day would come," she told Martin, who had fallen asleep in the old leather armchair. "Every document, every photo, every recording, everything was preserved and organized with the future in mind." The Mitchells' house, which was initially going to be sold quickly, became a symbol of resistance and the search for justice. Neighbors started bringing flowers to the garden. Neighborhood children helped clean up the yard. The community was sending a clear message: this house and its history mattered. "Grandpa always said that truth has its own time," Kevin recalled during a moment of reflection. "He planted the seeds 40 years ago, knowing that one day they would sprout." And so, as autumn began to paint Burlington's trees in shades of red and gold, Theodore Mitchell's legacy continued to unfold, revealing not only a story of corruption, but also a narrative of courage, patience, and unwavering faith in justice. The small team gathered at the Mitchell home, Rebecca, Kevin, Charlotte, Martin, and their ever-growing allies, knew that they were only just beginning to unravel the true extent of the story that Theodore had kept under wraps for so long. Each new day brought with it the promise of more revelations and the hope that justice would finally be done. The discovery of the warehouse on the outskirts of Burlington triggered a series of events that no one could have predicted. Among the documents found was a diary belonging to James Caldwell, a former counselor who died in 1989, which minutely detailed the secret meetings where the hospital scheme was hatched. "We need to protect these documents," said Marcus Bennett, leafing through the yellowed pages of the diary. "They are definitive proof that the embezzlement was premeditated and systematic." Charlotte organized an emergency meeting at the University of Vermont Library. In addition to the Mitchell brothers and Bennett, Sandra Caldwell, James's daughter, a university professor who had contacted Charlotte after reading the series of reports, was present. "My father changed in the last few years of his life," Sandra explained, her eyes watering. "He started writing compulsively as if he was trying to purge something from his conscience. Now I understand why." The diary revealed that Theodore wasn't the only one watching. James Caldwell had documented the scheme from the inside as a reluctant participant who gradually developed remorse. His notes provided names, dates, and most importantly, international bank account numbers. Rebecca spent nights analyzing the financial records. "The money didn't disappear completely," she explained during one of the meetings. "It was moved through a network of shell companies, but it left traces. With today's technology, we can follow those trails." The investigation gained an unexpected ally in Nathan Hayes, a young federal prosecutor who had lost a younger brother due to the lack of specialized pediatric care in Burlington in the 80s. "This is personal for me," said Hayes, examining the evidence in his office. "How many other families have suffered because some people decided that their bank accounts were more important than children's lives?" The pressure on those involved began to have an effect. William Blackwell resigned as superintendent of public works, citing personal reasons. Days later, he was seen boarding a flight to the Cayman Islands. Kevin, who had begun to receive more serious threats, installed security cameras around the Mitchells' house. "We're not going to be intimidated," he declared during a press conference. "My grandfather kept these secrets for decades to protect us. Now it's our turn to protect his legacy." The Burlington community has mobilized in an unprecedented way. A group of retired doctors organized a committee to revise the original plans for the Children's Hospital, bringing them up to modern standards. Architects volunteered to develop new designs. Local businessmen have pledged donations. It's as if the city is waking up from a long sleep, observed Charlotte, documenting the growing movement of popular support. Margaret Whitman emerged as a valuable source of information on the whereabouts of those involved who were still alive. Richard Hammond had an elaborate filing system, she revealed. Every important document had a copy hidden away in one of 3 different locations. The search for these locations led the team to an old country house on the outskirts of Burlington, a property that had belonged to Hammond. In the basement behind a false wall, they found a safe. "We need an expert," said Rebecca, examining the mechanism. "This isn't something we can just break into." Martin, who had developed an obsession with the case, contacted a former college colleague who worked in digital security. "The safe has an old electronic system," he explained. "It could be vulnerable to certain modern techniques." While they were working on the safe, Sandra Caldwell made another crucial discovery in her father's belongings. "I found this in a photo album," she said, handing Charlotte an envelope. Inside was a series of photographic negatives showing meetings between politicians and businessmen on a yacht. Daniel Rodriguez, the restoration expert, worked tirelessly to recover the images. "These photos are dynamite," he said, examining the enlargements. "You can clearly identify everyone present, and the date printed on the negatives coincides with the period of the main embezzlements." The investigation suffered a setback when Charlotte's office was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but files were searched, and her computer was damaged. "They're getting desperate," observed Marcus Bennett. "That means we're close to something big." Rebecca decided it was time to digitize all the important documents. "We can't risk losing anything," she explained, organizing a backup system on multiple secure servers. "Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence needs to be preserved." The breakthrough came when the safe was finally opened. Inside, as well as more incriminating documents, was a letter addressed to Theodore Mitchell, never delivered. Richard Hammond had written a full confession, detailing his participation in the scheme and expressing regret. "Your grandfather was more than a silent observer," Charlotte told Rebecca and Kevin. "He was the conscience that tormented them all. Even those who took part in the scheme couldn't escape the weight of what they had done." Hammond's letter, along with the accumulated evidence, was the catalyst the federal investigation needed. Nathan Hayes obtained search and seizure warrants for several properties linked to those involved who were still alive. "This is just the beginning," said Hayes, watching federal agents carry boxes of documents. "We're going to follow every embezzled dime to its final destination." The Mitchells' old house, which was initially going to be sold, had become a symbol of resistance and the search for justice. The family decided to postpone the sale indefinitely. "This house holds more than memories," said Rebecca. "It holds the truth that my grandfather protected for so long. And that truth hasn't finished coming to light yet." Prosecutor Nathan Hayes' office was buzzing with activity as federal agents methodically organized the evidence recovered from Hammond's safe. Rebecca watched through the glass window of the meeting room, the incessant movement of people carrying boxes and documents. "We've found something you need to see," said Hayes, interrupting her thoughts. In his hands he held a faded red folder with the seal of the state government. "This is a preliminary feasibility report on the Children's Hospital from 1975. The figures have been completely doctored." Charlotte, who was scanning documents in the corner of the room, approached quickly. "What do you mean?" "The original budget was 3 times higher than the one presented publicly," explained Hayes, spreading the papers out on the table. "They didn't just embezzle existing money, they manipulated the figures to justify a much larger state loan." Kevin, who had just arrived with coffee for everyone, left the drinks on the table and examined the documents. "So the scheme was even deeper than we imagined. It wasn't just an embezzlement, it was a systematic fraud from the start." The investigation took an even darker turn when Margaret Whitman showed up at the office unannounced, visibly upset. "I received this morning," she said, handing Charlotte a brown envelope. Inside were old photographs of her with Richard Hammond in compromising situations. "They're trying to shut me up," Margaret explained, her hands shaking. "But I've wasted a lot of time being afraid. Richard used it to manipulate me 40 years ago. It won't work now. Marcus Bennett immediately began preparing a protective order for Margaret. This just proves that we're getting close. They wouldn't be so desperate if we didn't have something substantial. The team worked tirelessly over the following weeks. Sandra Caldwell brought in more documents found in a secret compartment in her father's old house. Daniel Rodriguez managed to completely restore the Super 8 camera footage, revealing crucial meetings that took place at the Burlington Country Club. "Look at this," said Rebecca, pausing one of the restored videos. "That man in the background near the window. Isn't that the day the original hospital project was approved? Look how hopeful everyone looked." The photos showed a public ceremony with smiling politicians and celebrating citizens. In one of them, Theodore appeared in the background watching everything, with an expression that now seemed loaded with meaning. "He already knew," whispered Rebecca, gently touching her grandfather's photograph. Even at that moment, he had already realized that something was wrong and started documenting it. The committee for the new children's hospital called a public hearing to present the updated plans. The auditorium at City Hall was packed with people even watching on big screens set up outside. Sandra Caldwell, representing the commission, took to the stage. "This is not just a building project," she declared, her voice firm. "It's an act of collective redemption. Every brick of this hospital will be a testament to the truth that Theodore Mitchell protected for so long." The plans revealed a state-of-the-art facility with the capacity to serve not only Burlington, but the entire region. The project included a research center that would bear Theodore Mitchell's name. "Your grandfather never wanted recognition," Charlotte told Rebecca during the presentation. "But I think he would be happy to know that his name will be associated with saving lives, not hiding secrets." The indictments began to be announced the following week. 17 people were charged with various crimes including corruption, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Roger Morton, the mayor, officially resigned and agreed to cooperate with the investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence. "The truth has a cleansing power," observed Marcus Bennett, reviewing the documents in the case. "It's not just about punishment, it's about cleansing old wounds and allowing the city to finally heal." Rebecca spent an entire afternoon in her grandfather's office, organizing her notes for donation to the city's historical archive. Each page revealed not only evidence of crimes, but also the internal struggle of a man who had carried a heavy burden for decades to protect his family and his community. "I found this," said Kevin, entering the office with a yellowed envelope. It was a letter Theodore had written but never sent, addressed to his grandchildren. It was dated just a week before his death. "Dear Rebecca and Kevin," Rebecca read, aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "If you are reading this, it means that the moment I have been waiting for all my life has finally arrived. The truth I protected wasn't mine to reveal during my years of life. It was a legacy that needed to be uncovered at the right time by people brave enough to do the right thing. You are those people." Construction of the hospital began on a clear fall morning. Rebecca and Kevin were present at the groundbreaking ceremony, along with Charlotte Hayes Margaret, and all those who had helped uncover the truth. "Look," said Margaret, pointing to the sky. A rainbow had formed over the construction site, its bright colors reflecting off the excavators and the workers' helmets. "Grandpa used to say that there are no coincidences," smiled Kevin. "Just moments when the truth decides to show itself." The Mitchells' old house, which was originally going to be sold, has been transformed into a community center dedicated to transparency and social justice. The shelves that once held secrets now house resources for citizens seeking information about public projects and their rights. "Theodore Mitchell taught us that the truth is patient," wrote Charlotte in her last report on the case. "It waits for the right moment, the right heart, the right courage. And when that moment arrives, no conspiracy, no matter how powerful, can stop her light from shining." On a quiet afternoon, months after work had begun on the hospital, Rebecca found one last notebook hidden behind a loose panel in the office. On the final pages, Theodore had written, The true legacy is not what we keep, but what we release. The truth once planted always finds its way to the light. It was his safe, his secret archive. Rebecca nodded, stroking the worn cover of one of her grandfather's notebooks. The sale of the house would have to wait. There was a greater legacy at stake, a truth that needed to be revealed. And one last mission that Theodore Mitchell had entrusted, albeit silently, to his grandchildren. Charlotte was compiling all the evidence for a series of investigative reports, while a public prosecutor was already showing interest in the case. The construction of the children's hospital, abandoned for more than 40 years, could finally get off the ground. Grandpa always said that every choice has its consequences, Rebecca reflected. But some choices, even the hard ones, are necessary to make a difference in the world. Night was falling over Burlington, and in the Mitchells' old house, secrets, kept for decades, were finally beginning to come to light, promising to bring justice and redemption, just as Theodore had planned in his last and most important act of courage. Charlotte Anderson's report on the documents found in the Mitchells' house caused a real earthquake in Burlington. Just 3 days after its publication in the Burlington Free Press, the newsroom was inundated with phone calls from former public officials willing to talk, each bringing a different piece of the puzzle that Theodore had begun to put together decades ago. "Ms. Anderson," a shaky voice called out to Charlotte as she was leaving the newsroom. It was a lady of about 70, with gray hair and an elegant posture. "My name is Margaret Whitman. I was Richard Hammond's secretary in 1976. The meeting with Margaret turned out to be crucial. In a discreet cafe in the city center, she shared her own collection of documents, internal memos, diaries, and even photographs of secret meetings that corroborated Theodore's findings. "Your grandfather wasn't alone," Margaret explained to Rebecca and Kevin, whom Charlotte had invited to the meeting. "There were others who knew, but fear kept us silent." Meanwhile, at the Mitchells' old home, each day brought new discoveries. Martin, Rebecca's husband, began dedicating his evenings after work to helping in the search for more evidence. It was he who found behind a loose panel in the office a Super 8 camera and several cans of film. "We need to find someone who can restore this footage," said Rebecca, carefully examining the rusty cans. Knowing Grandpa, he wouldn't keep these without good reason. The search led them to Daniel Rodriguez, a specialist in old film restoration who worked at the University of Vermont. In his air-conditioned laboratory, the first images began to come to life, seemingly innocent gatherings in restaurants and golf clubs, but which, according to Theodore's meticulous notes, were actually meetings where decisions about embezzlement were made. "Your grandfather was a genius," commented Daniel, adjusting the projector. "He managed to document everything without arousing suspicion. The quality of these images is amazing for the time." The investigation took on a new dimension. When Charlotte discovered that some of those involved still had connections to current public projects. William Blackwell, the current superintendent of public works, was the nephew of one of the main conspirators identified in Theodore's documents. "This can't be a coincidence," Kevin observed, connecting dots on a large board they had set up in the living room of the house. "The same pattern of overbilling that Grandpa documented in the 1970s is being repeated in recent projects." Rebecca spent hours examining the most recent accounting records of the City Hall, which were now available online. Her background in finance, inherited from her grandfather, allowed her to identify similar patterns of irregularities. "It's like they never stopped," she muttered. "They just got more sophisticated." The pressure began to mount. Rebecca received anonymous calls suggesting that she leave the past in the past. Kevin found his car with flat tires. Charlotte was followed by a dark car on several occasions. "History repeating itself," said Margaret Whitman when she heard about the intimidation. "But this time it's different. You are not alone." The Burlington community began to mobilize. Former pediatric patients who had to travel to other states for treatment in the 1970s and 1980s began to share their stories. Families who lost loved ones due to the lack of a specialized hospital came forward. A group of volunteer lawyers, led by Marcus Bennett, offered to represent the cause pro bono. "What we have here," Bennett explained during a meeting at the public library, is not just a case of historic corruption. It's an open wound in the community that has never healed properly. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Charlotte received an anonymous email containing GPS coordinates. Following them, Rebecca and Kevin arrived at a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found boxes of documents that had "Current Mayor." Charlotte approached the screen, adjusting her glasses. Roger Morton. At the time, he was just a young aide, but he was clearly present at several of these meetings. The discovery of the connection with the current mayor took the case to a new level. Hayes obtained authorization for a wider operation, including wiretapping and electronic surveillance of the main suspects. Martin, who had become an expert in analyzing old bank records, identified a pattern in the transactions. They used a series of front companies to launder the money. The interesting thing is that some of these companies still exist. They've just changed their names. The pressure began to have an effect. William Blackwell from the Cayman Islands contacted Hayes through his lawyer, offering to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Roger Morton announced a temporary leave of absence from City Hall to attend to personal matters. Rebecca spent hours in her grandfather's old office, rereading his notes with a fresh eye. Grandpa wasn't just documenting the crime, she told Kevin during a particularly productive evening. He was building a safety net for when the truth came out. The Burlington community continued to mobilize. A group of local doctors and business owners formed a committee to assess the feasibility of restarting the original Children's Hospital project, now with modern technology and updated facilities. "This is bigger than just justice," observed Charlotte, working on her latest report. "It's about righting a historic wrong that affected generations of families in Burlington." The investigation suffered a setback when Hayes's office was the target of a suspicious fire. Fortunately, thanks to the backup system implemented by Rebecca, no evidence was lost. The attack only served to strengthen the team's resolve. "They're desperate," said Hayes, watching the firefighters control the last of the flames. "But they don't realize that every attempt to stop us only proves that we're on the right track." Sandra Caldwell organized an exhibition at the university, presenting a detailed timeline of the case from the first signs of corruption to the recent discoveries. The exhibition attracted hundreds of visitors, including families who had been affected by the lack of the hospital in previous decades. "Your grandfather would be the first to say that the truth can't be buried forever," Margaret told Rebecca during the exhibition. "He planted the seeds of justice, and now we are seeing the fruits of his patience and courage." The investigation was entering its decisive phase. Hayes was preparing to present the evidence to the grand jury while Charlotte was finalizing a special series of reports that promised to shake up the power structures in Burlington. "Tomorrow will be a historic day," said Kevin, watching the sunset through the window of his grandfather's office. Rebecca, next to him, was holding one of Theodore's old notebooks. "Grandpa always said that the truth has its own time," she replied, flipping through the yellowed pages. "I think the time has finally come for his truth to be heard." The grand jury was convened on a chilly October morning. Nathan Hayes adjusted his tie as he watched the members arrive at the federal courthouse in Burlington. Outside, a small crowd gathered, including families who had lost loved ones due to the absence of the Children's Hospital in recent decades. "Is everyone ready?" asked Hayes, gathering his team in an adjacent conference room. Rebecca and Kevin Mitchell, Charlotte Anderson, Margaret Whitman, and Sandra Caldwell nodded silently. The last few weeks had been intense, with new evidence emerging almost daily. William Blackwell's testimony, broadcast live from the Cayman Islands via video conference, was devastating. He detailed how the corruption scheme had evolved over the years, adapting to technological and political changes, but keeping its original core of participants virtually intact. "The money never really disappeared," Blackwell explained, his voice trembling slightly. "It was reinvested in property shell companies and offshore accounts. The original amount with interest must exceed $100 million today." Rebecca, sitting in the front row of the gallery, held tightly to one of her grandfather's accounting notebooks. Theodore's meticulous notes had predicted exactly that money left traces no matter how much time passed. The tension reached its peak when Roger Morton was called to testify. The mayor, who had hastily returned from his leave of absence, seemed to have aged decades in a few weeks. His testimony began with vehement denials but collapsed when Hayes presented the restored Super 8 camera footage. "Do you recognize this young aide, Mr. Morton?" asked Hayes, pausing the video at a particularly sharp frame. "Because Theodore Mitchell certainly did, and he documented every meeting you attended." Morton broke down. In an emotional testimony, he revealed how he had been co-opted by the scheme at a young age, and how the weight of that secret had tormented him for decades. "Theodore Mitchell was like a ghost haunting us," he admitted. "We always knew he knew we always dreaded the day when the truth would come out." Outside the courthouse, Charlotte was coordinating a reporting team that was broadcasting the events in real time. The story had gone beyond the borders of Burlington, attracting national attention. Television crews from all over the country flocked to the courthouse steps. Martin, who had become an expert in tracing old financial transactions, worked with a team from the FBI to map the fate of every penny embezzled. "It's like a spider's web," he explained during a break in the trial. "Each thread leads to another, and in the center is the money that should have saved so many lives." The most moving moment of the day came when Margaret Whitman presented her private collection of evidence. Years working as Hammond's secretary had given her access to information that not even Theodore knew about. "I've kept all this for so long," she said, her voice breaking. "Just like Theodore, I knew that one day we would have to tell this story." Kevin, watching the proceedings next to his sister, whispered, "Grandpa knew this would happen. He prepared everything, every document, every piece of evidence, waiting for the right moment." As more witnesses were heard, a clear pattern emerged. The scheme hadn't just stolen public money, it had created a culture of corruption that perpetuated itself for generations. Young politicians and businessmen were initiated into the scheme, keeping it alive long after its original architects had departed. Sandra Caldwell presented a detailed analysis of her father's documents, demonstrating how the scheme had evolved and adapted over the years. "They became more sophisticated," she explained, "but the basic principles remained the same: diverting public funds for private gain." At the end of that long day, Hayes gathered her team together again. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The grand jury will continue hearing witnesses for the next few days, but we already have enough material for several indictments." Rebecca returned to her grandfather's house that evening, exhausted but hopeful. In Theodore's office, now transformed into an informal operations center, she found Charlotte working on her final report. "Your grandfather wasn't just an accountant," said Charlotte without taking her eyes off the screen. "He was a guardian of the truth, a chronicler of corruption, who knew that one day the story would have to be told." The commission responsible for the new Children's Hospital project announced that with the recovery of the embezzled funds, construction could begin in less than a year. Preliminary plans were presented showing a modern facility that would honor the original 1976 vision. "Theodore Mitchell did not live to see this day," Charlotte concluded in her report, "but his legacy of truth and justice has finally blossomed. The story he guarded for so long wasn't just about corruption. It was about hope, patience, and the unshakable belief that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the light." As night fell over Burlington, the Mitchells' old house remained illuminated, its windows shining like beacons in the darkness. Inside, the team continued to work, untangling the last threads of the web of corruption that Theodore had begun to unravel decades ago. The truth, as he had always known, had its own time. The grand jury deliberated for 3 days before presenting its findings. During this time, Burlington lived in a state of restrained anticipation. In the Mitchells' old house, now transformed into a makeshift operations center, Rebecca and her team were organizing the massive amount of evidence they had collected over the last few months. "The Justice Department just called," Hayes announced, rushing into the room. "We've managed to trace more than 80% of the embezzled funds. The accounts in the Cayman Islands have been frozen. The news provoked a wave of emotion among those present. Charlotte, who hadn't slept properly for days, let out a sigh of relief. Kevin hugged his sister while Martin began making quick calculations on his tablet. With the appreciation over the years and the interest accrued, Martin explained, "We're talking about a value close to $150 million, more than enough to build not just one, but two modern pediatric hospitals." The impact of the investigation spread like ripples on a pond. In addition to Burlington, other cities began to re-examine old public projects that never got off the ground. Theodore Mitchell had inadvertently started a transparency movement that went beyond Vermont's borders. Margaret Whitman, who had become something of a mentor to the group, arrived carrying a box of old photographs. "I found these in the back of a cupboard," she said, spreading the images out on the kitchen table. "They're from the